Bruce. Thank you for inviting me to talk about art in utopia. And this has been a topic that I've been interested in for 40 years. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts about it. And I guess there are actually two themes in how they come together. And the one is utopia, the eudaimonic society for Bhaskar, for example. And the other is art. And then how could art and utopia, how do they come together or don't come together, or what are the folds between them? And I would like to sketch a little bit of a modern Western set of genealogies of kind of leads up and informs my own thinking, and I think sort of is in the background of a number of the thinkers we read today. And the first of these would be the issue of eudaimonia itself. And this is a long history of coming out of Thomas More, which is actually a very complex text in the Renaissance, the notion of a utopia, right? This particular a place. And in the modern period, in the 18th century, with the emergence in the West of the Enlightenment and the rise of notions of human progress on the one hand, and on the other, that human reason, some form of reason, can actually help steer. Humanity can steer itself through reason towards increasing the well-being on the planet. The notion of utopia began to itself shift, and even expressed in facets of the visual arts, like in architecture. Manfredo Tofuri, the great Italian architectural historian, has written several books just on this topic. You find it in imaginary architecture. So even in architecture, these ideal places, inspired by the notion of human progress, and that we can self-determine through reason, begins to reshape the notion of utopia. In the early 20th century, in German thinking, there's a whole complex array of notions of utopics. A wide variety of thinkers, some more familiar than others to an English audience. One of the most prominent and complex is Ernst Bloch, his notion of utopia, this impulse of matter, actually, the impulse of matter towards greater and greater progress. Adorno, the great philosopher Adorno, very complexly, I'll speak a little about him, hid it a little bit, sort of hidden his way of thinking this. Even Walter Benjamin, in his notion of the messianic that was taken up by Derrida later, have certain of these dimensions to them. For me, the most interesting recent example of thinking this issue of utopics is Roy Bhaskar's work, his book on dialectics, and the notion of the eudaimonic society. And Bhaskar's notion is very, very subtle and very complex, I think. And if I would sort of try to explicate it quickly, what he speaks of is the pulse of freedom, this pulse towards the eudaimonic society, in which there is a concrete manifestation, universal and honoring the singularity of beings at the same time, of the well-being of each and the well-being of other, mutually inform one another, so there's true non-reductive flourishing. And this sounds like wow, but what Bhaskar does is he actually does draw upon a sense of reason found in strains of earlier German idealism, Hegel especially. And he argues, he rationally reconstructs, to use Habermas's phrase, he argues that there's an inherent logic, not in the mind, but an inherent logic in being, in human being, which actually demonstrates a kind of movement from the baby and parents all the way to this mutual flourishing. There's a kind of inherent dialectic, inherent in impulse, inherent in being, that he reconstructs as an expression of reason in this capital R sense. And here he's actually drawing upon the work of Jürgen Habermas, who took Immanuel Kant's notion of a regulative idea of reason. These ideas of reason are not Platonic in Kant, they are regulative. They pressure manifestation or our understanding of manifestation. They have potential causal force, but they're not actually like models or templates in and of themselves. What Habermas argued, and the more I reflect on it, the more I'm impressed by it, is that built into language, whether we recognize it or not, is a kind of regulative idea in our communication, which just by the very nature of language and exchange of language, has a regulative idea that's now not in the mind, in consciousness, subjective, but in our practices together with language. And this pressures the movement towards the stronger argument, that the stronger argument in various spheres actually is where language is pushing in certain kinds of exchanges. And we can honor it or we can not honor it. We can tune into it, we can not tune into it, but it's inherent there. So it's a kind of embodied regulative idea inherent in our speech acts with one another when there are breakdowns and we're seeking the truth of some kind. And we then avoid violence, hopefully, is what we do. What Bhaskar, I believe, did is he took this embodied notion of a regulative idea of reason and reconstructed not simply communication acts, but actually the very pulse of humanity itself. And I guess I actually wrote about this somewhere. I'm forgetting exactly what I said, but he's taking this Habermasian ideal. And so the status of this impulse of freedom is not a guarantee it's going to happen. It's more like there's a kind of actual pressure within human manifestation and human social arrangements and in humanity to move in this direction. So it's regulative, but not strongly causally determinative. It's not predictive, and yet it's a kind of moral force. And the idea sense here is that this is for Bhaskar it's potentially realizable, but there's no guarantee we're going to realize it. So I think it's a very, very sophisticated philosophical articulation of eudaimonia, one that has a dialectical structure in Bhaskar's nuanced dialectics, takes into account social formations, has various scales of perspective and chunking, and honors this reworked notion of a regulative idea. So I think that's probably the most sophisticated version of the movement towards utopia that I've come across in contemporary writing. So the second strain of this is art. And art actually, in the modern period, in the Germanic tradition in the modern period, also began to associate utopia, or at least let's call it redemption in some broad sense, with art or with aesthetic experience more broadly. And in the wake of Kant, the key figure here was the poet Schiller, who in his lectures on the aesthetic education of man took off on Kant and argued that it was art through generating an aesthetic experience that was the one way of healing the sort of fragmentation that was incipient in modernity and in our consciousness. And here he's actually echoing Kant's third critique, but making it more social historical and giving a very big place then for art implicitly, that art is this healing power, that the disruption of value spheres, both externally and internally to ourselves, it's art and the kind of an aesthetic experience it engenders that actually can do the healing work in some sense. That's a big claim, and it gives art a great importance. And art would take on huge importance in Germanic thinking and also in continental thinking in general. So, for example, Hegel, wrote about art in his large philosophical scheme of the unfolding of spirit. His friend and contemporary Schelling, in earlier writings, actually took issue with Hegel implicitly, whereas Hegel saw art as not the highest form of the expression of spirit, Schelling actually argued it was at one point in his writings, that it wasn't religion, it wasn't philosophy, it was art. I mean, that's a huge claim, it's a different philosophical tack than Schiller, but art becomes this all-important and paramount and supreme expression of human creativity and has the greatest import for human flourishing potentially, even though it's not made completely concrete, how that translates into social formations. If you move later in the century, the massively influential thinker Friedrich Nietzsche, his first book, 1871, was on art, The Birth of Tragedy. And those kinds of themes, especially the Dionysian developed there, will change and run throughout his career and be essential. Heidegger in the early 20th century came to the conclusion that the West had these modes of being, these modalities in which people in the world appear, both reveal and withdraw. And there were these epochs of this, different styles of it. And he really did not think it was the modern and late modern versions of this were benign. He thought they were dangerous. And he countered a sense of art as the available alternative form of disclosing being, both the world and of our existence. This was the poetical disclosure of being, in contrast to the more sort of system instrumental forms of being he formulated in the 1930s and early 40s. In the more radical political sphere of thinkers who had Marxist influence, Bloch linked his notions of utopia to art early on, and Adorno, who really saw where he really kind of had a dialectical story of art entrapment, actually believed that non-linguistic forms of art, musical form, pictorial form, and so on, had a kind of hidden, silent, redemptive structure of what was possible for us. But the trick for him was once you used language, you were trapped in sort of capitalist mechanisms. He thought language was really co-opted by capital processes, and he was deeply influenced by George Lukács here. And then in France, of course, art has been huge. Just think of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was, Nobel laureate in literature, great playwright, and of course was a communist and wrote, two major treatises on dialectics and social transformation. So art was really crucial to him. You could turn to Maurice Blanchot, and then the late Foucault, the latest works. How do we get out of the traps of modernity, of late modernity? Well, we have to do a kind of form of aesthetic redemption. We turn our own lives into works of art to sort of escape the traps of modern disciplinary structures. We recreate ourselves. We shine beautifully. It's a limited notion, but here art transforms into we become a work of art in some sense. So the continental stream has had a sense of what I call sometimes aesthetic redemption, in which art is to play some kind of special role in aiding humanity under modern conditions. And it's a really rich tradition, and my hope is that it's not lost, that we don't forget the richness of these writings and of what they're up to. So how can we more explicitly think about utopia, given these strains which do intersect, and that of art? Well, one figure who was essential to me in graduate school, really essential, was the writer Frederick Jameson, who in many ways assimilated all the writings I'm talking about, quite honestly, particularly the Germanic tradition, and developed a very unique approach to cultural criticism, in which in 1981 he published a book called The Political Unconscious. And what he argued was that modern literature and modern art actually had within it, at the level of form, the structure of it, not just the content, but the form of it, was actually templating, folding within itself social contradictions. And these were sort of unconscious, like they're not always explicit in the work of art, but they're actually impacting the unconscious, political unconscious of the audience They're working out certain unstated themes and tensions in the social formation in either positive, regressive ways. And he thought in a 1970, an earlier essay about mass culture in Utopia a few years earlier, a classic essay for me. It's a very postmodern approach. He says that this isn't just in modern art, in high art, which it would have been for Adorno, that this can appear in mass art. This could appear on a TV show. This can appear in a film. And he gave a brilliant analysis of the Godfather films in that respect. And it can be regressive. I mean, the solutions that are hinted at can be regressive in artworks. So Jameson is arguing that there's a new kind of allegory that is sort of subliminally operative in a lot of art today, both high art, so to speak, and in mass art, in which social problematics of various kinds become encoded. They're sort of the allegorical background of what the work of art is actually working out in some sense. And while this sounds abstract, maybe I can give an example of this. And that I gave this years ago as a way of thinking this, and it's probably dated. But it's the television show Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I think this is online, the write-up of this in academia.edu. But it tries to, the point is that sort of the next generation universe, here appearing within the first decade of the neoliberal revolution of global capital, is actually sort of a compensatory fantasy of a kind. I mean, I think a good one, and has a high moral structure often, which is very positive. But in the end is, capital had actually reached a kind of liminal state. It needed to create non-material spheres of investment. This is the whole financial sector that takes on, derivative after derivative after derivative after derivative. And then the internet later would come as a source of capital. We were reaching a point of limits of the earth, the limits of capital to work with the materiality of the earth. The global community had formed through the new electronic media, or about to. And so the system was reaching its limits, or had reached its limits, in a variety of ways that now we're so aware of. And Star Trek then just projects those structures of, society, different races, different cultures, planets as nation states, or planets as places of particular cultures or ethnicities, and different political organizations. But now within the boundlessness of space, so there's no limit, there's always something new to discover. So it becomes, in this reading, this would be a very Jamesonian reading, it's unconsciously trying to reassure us of a lack of limits in our contemporary system, a lack of limits of some kind. There are other dimensions in Star Trek. I could go through a bunch of them. Another one is the importance of data, the robot data. What's that about? And then Borg. The Borg itself became really big in The Next Generation. Now, the Borg are these cyborgs, which has a long history in writing in the 20th century. They're cyborgs. They have implants. They assimilate all species, and they turn them into these cyborgs that have no sense of I. They're a kind of we, and they just go around and assimilate everything. And they're a kind of, they're just a system. And the individuals are just cogs in this system. And it's a complete suppression, according, in this science fiction show, of real dimensionalized interiority. And they just go along and gobble everything up. Well, these are the worst. What is this? These are the Frankfurt School critiques, the Heideggerian critiques of a modernity that's one-sidedly about instrumentality, colonizes interiors in Habermas's sense, and just assimilates everything, no matter what it is, into this, and just grows. It's an endless growth with no sense of change in quality, just quantity, just bigger and bigger, more of a machine. Nothing can stop it. A boundless growth that dehumanizes. The contrast, the opposing force to this, is the Federation. and it becomes sort of emblematized by the main crew on the Enterprise, who actually embody both sort of amber military structures, but orange rational structures and green self-determining structures. You know, they're all operative here. People are given time off, officers are given time off to do vision quests. And it's multicultural and multiracial, and there's women on there. It becomes a kind of, not just a family, it becomes a kind of postmodern multicultural community that goes beyond bureaucracy, that's grown beyond money. It becomes the ideal. It becomes the ideal of I and we in a structure of purpose versus the Borg. And these are set up here as two different social orders that are conflicting with one another. And unconsciously, you know, this Jamesonian reading would have it, and I think it's right, particularly back when it first came out, somewhere people are sensing this. The machine is here, it's meaningless, it just gobbles it up, it's all exteriors, it's quantity over quality, versus this idealized crew that self-actualizes in some sense. So science fiction is a great example for Jameson of these kinds of instances where all kinds of contemporary concerns, every level, thinking of the four quadrants, are encoded more than just the manifest content, and that the work of art tries to work it out in some sense. And these kind of thoughts, this kind of background in my own education has led to a sense that, you know, if we look at the history of art, there may be in art itself, from the beginning, something that I would call a kind of impulse towards, like a promise of something better, you know, sort of partially echoing Ernst Bloch. You know, the great Viennese art historian Alois Riegel came up with the phrase, the Kunstwollen, the art impulse, which he meant something different about. And I think if there's a kind of trans-historical art impulse, a kind of quote-unquote pure art impulse, it's this impulse of offering a kind of manifest concrete, because it's art, it's about the concrete, not just a theory, a concrete of something better. And it can be compensatory, it can be a substitute, it can have a lot of functions, but it offers something, a promise of that. I think that's the art impulse, from cave paintings to the present. And so it links to utopia very directly. That said, art itself, that impulse can become distorted. Bhaskar talked about the demi-real, you know, the fractures in society, and they get into art. They get into art almost all the time. So anything like a transcendental argument for this art impulse that I'm speaking about, this promise of something better, as manifest concretely, right, in something sensuous, even in the sensuousness of literary and poetic language, is always, you know, in part being captured by the demi-real. And so that impulse can lead to art that has redemptive, utopic, dystopic, neutral dimensions all within one work. So you can still get art that is regressive. You can get art that's captured by those demi-real, and rather than reworking them in a utopian direction, reinforce them. And I think our mass culture is awash in all kinds of art forms. All kinds of art forms, and more of them than we would like to think, I think, have certain regressive dimensions to them, unfortunately. They aren't really pointing these concrete ways. So to summarize, it seems to me that art and utopia are a natural fit, that one of the resources for utopic thinking is to look for artworks that are imaginatively, creatively reworking contemporary tensions in the direction of concrete solutions, actually concrete solutions, and therefore become a resource for both theorists, for activists, and even just to be inspired, to be moved in that direction under challenging times. So that would be a few quick thoughts about art and utopia. I hope they're useful. And Bruce, as always, thank you so much for letting me share these thoughts. Thank you.